You're listening to the Ctrl-Alt-Secure podcast, where we talk all things cybersecurity. I'm your host, Valentina Flores, CEO of Sentry. Welcome. Hi, everyone. Valentina Flores, CEO of Sentry, and this is the Ctrl-Alt-Secure podcast, where we talk about all things cybersecurity. And today I brought on an expert in CMMC certification. His team and his company do a lot, but there's been a lot of questions from clients lately about this certification. Who needs it? What does it do? What are the changes coming around this certification? So we're going to talk about that a little bit today in deep dives. Brian Guenther, thank you so much for coming on. Brian is with Exceed Cyber. So tell me a little bit about your background and your current role at Exceed.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it. I always like to talk about and evangelize the CMMC world and kind of clear up some of the mess out there, right? So Exceed Cyber has been around as a company for about 7 years, but it's not my first rodeo, as they say. I've been in this business in the IT management and security business for over 20 years. And our team focuses on helping organizations, primarily those that have requirements that are kind of foisted upon them from above somewhere, whether it's legal, regulatory, contractual, compliance requirements. We help them kind of get in line, right? Whether it's CMMC for defense contractors, whether it's ISO 27001 or SOC 2 Type 2, we help them in that compliance journey. But we're also a managed security services provider as well, an MSSP, if you will, for your audience out there. In some cases, we also do manage IT as well, but not so much of that.
Okay, so an MSSP, but you focus a lot on compliance journey and getting those clients ready.
Exactly. Yes, that's really our primary focus is that side of it, because we try to be as focused as we can be.
So let's take a step back for a second. So CMMC, what is it? Who actually needs it? Tell us a little bit more about the basics of it.
Sure. Yeah. I'm always happy to, like I said, demystify what it's all about. So CMMC, first of all, let's unpack the acronym, which the DoD loves acronyms. I mean, folks out there know that. It stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which is a mouthful. But really what it means is that defense contractors, so in other words, these are companies out there that make a product or provide a service to the Defense Department as what's called a prime contractor. That's a direct relationship with the DoD, or that they're subcontractors. So think like a general contractor building a house. Same idea, right? You've got a general contractor, very similar in the DoD, what's called supply chain, the defense supply chain. And so really what CMMC is effectively a mechanism by which the DoD can ensure that you as a defense contractor in that supply chain have secured your systems, your information systems, to make sure that the data that the DoD cares about is actually correctly protected. That's what CMMC is. And we'll talk a little bit more later about why CMMC is kind of not so sudden and why people think it kind of came out of the blue. But really, it's ensuring that you engaged and put in the protections that you were supposed to put in place.
Yeah, so it's a way to standardize that whole supply chain down, which we both know supply chain is so important to cybersecurity, and especially when you talk about the government and the DoD. I mean, just so many different vendors and contractors.
Yes, and specifically, just to add a little more definition to this, right? Because what the DoD cares about is their data, right? So we have two different, we'll talk a little bit more about the maturity levels later, but effectively making sure that the information that you hold that's theirs or that either you created or that they created and handed to you is going to safeguard. And that's a term that's used as safeguarding, right? And that's connected to NIST 800-171, Special Publication 171. And in the end, what they really want to make sure is that you are keeping that data confidential. So if you're familiar with the concept of CIA triad, right? If you have gone through security training or a practitioner, you would know what that means. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? It goes further than like CIANA, but ultimately, this is only concerned about confidentiality. It's really just making sure the data remains confidential.
That's interesting. I actually didn't know that. I never thought about which one of those it tackled before. So after years of setbacks, what happened to CMMC this year? Because I know some stuff changed.
Yeah. So a lot of folks out there tended to believe that CMMC is never going to happen, right? Because it really took a long time to really kind of, it sort of took off and kind of came back down. Then it just really ramped up. And guess what? We have launch. That's where we're at today. So CMMC went through a couple of different iterations over the last 5 years since it was first birthed, if you will, right, by the DoD and other Johns Hopkins and other big brains from the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute. A lot of people put their brains together and said, you know what? We need to make sure we have a program that verifies that these controls are put in place. A lot of people think that CMMC is new. And really what it is, I mentioned earlier, that CMMC is really the validation to make sure you did as a defense contractor and in the supply chain, that you did what you're always supposed to have done. And I'll unpack that for just a second. And if any of our listeners are familiar with DFARS regulation, it's Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. In 2017, they published the DFARS, what's called the DFARS 7012 clause. It has a longer number, but I'll spare you that. But ultimately, that said that all defense contractors must safeguard their data based on the NIST 800-171, 110 controls, right? CMMC is really just the mechanism they're using to ensure it was done. Contractually, it's already been required for many years. So that's something that I want to make sure that your listeners and your viewers understand as we're clearing this up. This is not new. The validation is new and now going into effect.
So that being said, are there a lot of contractors out there that already have all the boxes checked? It's about just checking them on this official form? Or is it something where most people were kind of ignoring it?
So, like anything a lawyer will tell you, depends, right? It's probably more the latter that you're describing, that you have a lot of folks that are just sort of holding off. Well, let's see what the DoD does, right? And that inside of the CMMC ecosystem is a lot of what you're hearing from contractors. And look, the reality is the smaller they are, the less likely they're to implement because they may not even know about it, right? They may have heard about it peripherally. Maybe their upstream sub or their prime didn't even tell them they needed to do it. But now the hammer's coming down and the requirements are, again, have already been in place. So is it, I'm going to go back to your original question. It's more likely that these things were not done or done very impartially, maybe attempted and aborted. And I don't know all of them. There are 300,000 companies in the defense supply chain,
Wow.
all of whom CMMC applies to, by the way, at least at a basic maturity level 1.
That's very interesting. And I mean, obviously, the hammer coming down this year and it being more formalized was a huge change, but there's
Mhm.
changes coming in 2025 as well. Can you talk to those changes and what makes them different?
Yeah, of course. That's an important one for your listeners to understand. So this year, what went into effect is going to affect actually today is the title, what's called CFR 32, which is a CMMC regulation with all its various components about testing, attestation, the authorizing the third-party assessors. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff looped into that. It's hundreds of pages. So if you want a light read, check it out.
No, thanks.
That's going into effect December 15, 2024. However, next year in 2024, to your question, what's coming to effect is what's called Title 48 or 48 CFR. That piece essentially is the component by which contracting officers by the DoD that allocate and assign contracts, that award contracts to primes effectively, right? That then they then push it down to the subcontractors, those primes. It will then be included in contracts starting next year. It is estimated sometime Q1, Q2, 2025. And they're also, by the way, once that is done and fully validated and rolled out in regulation, there's going to be a 3-year phased rollout.
Okay, yeah, I'd love that. And
Mhm.
so you've mentioned the maturity levels a couple times. About
Yeah,
that for a second. What are the different levels involved?
of course. Yeah. So maturity level 1 effectively means that you as a defense contractor must safeguard what's called FCI, Federal Contract Information, to be clear. There are 15 controls based on FAR, which is a different regulation, FAR 52204, a couple numbers behind that, I forget. But there's like 15 controls, none of which include policies or procedures, really more or less technical controls. Most organizations should be able to check those boxes by what they do on a daily basis to manage their IT and their cybersecurity posture, if you will. Let's just say that's the case. However, that's maturity level 1, right? That's considered, and everybody, by the way, has to achieve maturity level 1 and attest to that as well. Attestation must come from the leader or the owner of the company, right? And if that's not right, we're not going to get into the False Claims Act today. The next level, maturity level 2, it gets much more difficult. That's 110 controls, the entirety of the NIST 800-171 Special Publication 171, Revision 2, which is technically deprecated right now because Revision 3 is live, but they use Revision 2. It's 110 controls. Now, to be clear, it's not just technical controls. It's policies, it's
Policies. Yeah.
procedures, it's technical controls, it's people controls, right? It's a bunch of stuff. It's physical controls. It's a whole bunch of stuff that is not just your IT people being able to handle that, right? And that's a lot to wade through those weeds.
I feel like we hear about two the most, but maybe it's because that's when people end up coming to us is when they're entering those higher levels. Is it
Mhm.
something where it's one after the other, like they get one, then two, then three, or is it certain levels based on what they're doing for the contract?
Yeah, so it's not it's you could say technically it's iterative or it's stacks, if you
Mhm.
will, like blocks effectively. The estimate by the DoD, and it's an estimate to be clear, because we don't know, they don't know all the customers, all the defense
Right.
contractors downstream through the supply chain. They don't know all of them because they're mostly known to the primes. That
Right.
award, and by the way, I want to make sure I say this. There is a requirement by the DoD, it's built into the law, into the regulation, called a flow down requirement. And that means if the prime has to do this, all the subs downstream, it flows down to everybody to the end of the road, right? Everyone has to achieve that. So,
And is
how is
the
this?
prime responsible for making sure their downflows have that done, or is it just like a trust basis?
In theory, yes, the prime should be, and I believe that's part of the regulation, that the flow down requirement is built into actually DFAR 7012, which has been around since 2017. Okay. And so that is now, again, reiterated within the CFR 32, especially CFR 48, that puts it into contracts, right? That's coming next, middle of next year. So your question is, what happens at maturity level two? At maturity level two, how is that assigned to the defense contractor? Well, it's assigned to the prime, right? And the prime has to flow it down, and it has to do with what the contracting officer at the DoD, before they award the contract, believes the data, the content, the information will be contained within that contract, right? The estimate is that about 70% need to only be maturity level one. 27 to 28%, and I'm getting rough numbers, right, because these are estimates, are maturity level two and require certification. And that's really the bulk of what we're talking about here. Because maturity level one, most organizations can achieve on their own. Maturity level two, it's going to require help. If you want to sort of do a go it yourself process, you'll probably fail your audit, right? What's called the assessment. It's not technically an audit, it's an assessment by a third party. And then a very small percentage, generally considered to only be big primes, will be like 1%, maybe two, that have to hit maturity level three. And that requires maturity level two. And then what's called the DIBCAC, which is a Defense Industrial Based Cybersecurity Assessment Center. They come in and do that top level third tier certification for those last 24 controls, which is part of NIST 800-172. Okay. So now that I made your head spin, that's kind of the order of operations in which things happen. But about 70-ish% are expected to only be level one, 15 controls, almost 30% level two, and a very, very small percentage level three.
Okay, so you said level one, they're pretty much they can do it themselves.
Generally, they can. They may require help, but they could.
So level two, what are kind of the first steps to this process? What are like the first steps they should do to see what their gaps are? How do they prepare for it?
Yeah. So if they haven't done compliance related work before, our recommendation is work with a company that will help you elevate yourself to a point where you can actually, first of all, identify what you have, right? For example, like you have nothing, you know you've done nothing, you got to start with a gap assessment, but you may not even do that because why spend time and money on something that you know you've never done? So really what we need is a compliance program. Working with an organization, again, such as us, it doesn't have to be Exceed Cyber, but whomever, to help you identify how to build a compliance program, because that's really what you need, right? And ultimately, over time, what has to happen is that we got to kind of scope out where you are, where you need to go, talk about a timeline, talk about the policies are so crucial. Policies are central to a compliance program, the procedures around that, and what controls have to be implemented. But that can take from maturity level two, I want to be very clear to the audience here, can take a good 12 to 24 months
I was going to
to
ask that.
get there, right? So the runway, the timeline, it's a long timeline. And consider this, you may have not budgeted for this or allocated resources internally that are points of contact who are going to deal with these issues and answer questions, right? Think about that. And the go it alone procedure or process, while well intentioned to potentially save money, is in the end going to shoot you in the foot. And you also need to consider, do you have enough business with the DoD? If you
Yeah.
make 100 grand a year off the DoD and your margins maybe 10%, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
You might want to stop working with the DoD, just to be very clear.
So with the rollout plan and kind of like the hammer coming down, but it takes 10 to 12 to 24 months, how does that work?
Maturity
Like,
level two, to be clear.
yeah, so if they start the process, they're able to show some kind of letter of engagement that like, hey, I'm working on it.
Well, I'm going
Like,
to give you the heavy answer here, right? The heavy answer is you're not going to like my answer. And my answer is if your contract requires, and again, there's legacy inclusions, often inclusion by reference, right? By just referencing a DFARS regulation. Again, this DFARS regulation 7012, you already should have done that.
Right.
Technically, you are, I don't want you to, the term that a GovCon attorney told me was not in breach of contract, but you're outside of your contract. So what do they do from here, right? So they ultimately, I want to make sure I answer your question. Can you reframe your question again for
Yeah,
me?
so I'm a gov contractor. I've been doing my best over the past few years, but I haven't really been like doing a total assessment, obviously. Not me in this make believe
Of
scenario.
course.
So I'm like, okay, you know what? Hammer's coming down. I need to focus and do this. I'm going to engage with Exceed to kind of do a gap assessment, make sure my ducks are in a row. What happens from there? Are my current contracts going to be affected? Can I not apply for RFPs and things this year? Or is there leeway as this is a new launch? Not
Okay,
a new
so
launch.
current contracts may be infected because we're talking about DFAR 7012 clauses that are already included in contracts going years and years back, right? Maturity level 2, we talked about these 110 controls. That's to safeguard this data that the DoD cares about, but I haven't told you what that is, right? And that's what's called controlled unclassified information. And that's just it's a sort of a very broad, I don't know, umbrella that covers a bunch of different sort of sub definitions around what type of data that is. It could be controlled technical information, it could be no foreign, which means no foreign eyes on this information. It
Mhm.
could be ITAR, right? ITAR is a very high level of CUI, which is international trade and arms regulation. It could be a lot of different types of data, but that's the data that you need to safeguard under maturity level 2. That's the information that the DoD cares about and is no longer just being okay with you not safeguarding it, right? And that's what this is all about. So to answer your question, what then happens if could you lose out on a contract? Could you potentially have a contract rescinded or revoked if it were audited? If the DCAA, the Defense Contract Audit Agency, came in to audit your contracts, could that happen? Yes, all that could happen. Specifically, we'll focus on contract, not rescinding of existing contracts, but contract award. The contract officer pushes it down through the prime and the prime down through its sub chain, if you will, right? Through the flow down requirements. When that happens, the prime again should make sure that all subs downstream should be compliant. But the subs themselves, of their own volition or on their own, are also responsible for making sure it's implemented, irrespective of whether the prime told them, right? Because the contract they accepted from the prime
Still
should
have it.
include all these things. In the end, there absolutely is an effect, and the CO, the contracting officer, shouldn't award the contract to the prime if these requirements are not met.
Yeah, sense.
And that's a lot.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's been around. They should have been doing these things. This is kind of more just formalizing it. And
It's checking the
obviously,
boxes. Did you
yeah,
do what you're supposed to do? That's what CMMC really is.
right. And I think compliance in general has a bad rep. Everyone doesn't want to do it. It takes time. It's annoying. The point is these things are there for a reason. And
Right.
we had to formalize the certification because you guys weren't doing it the first time. So, it's just like,
Bingo.
seatbelts wouldn't be mandatory if everyone was just wearing them on their own. But we didn't. So then we had to put in these things. So I think, when we look at compliance, it's like, these things are going to make your company better, your product better. They're going to make you more secure, your entire supply chain more secure. So it's good things in there. And if you can find, companies and partners that make that journey easier and smoother, it doesn't have to be so painful of a process.
Grow up, it's part of life, right? You got to do things you don't really want to do, but you have to do. You got to play by certain rules. That's just part of adulting, right? And running a business. And I don't mean be glib or be rude here. It's not the objective. But some people look at that as a stick. You're making me do things that hurts and costs me money, time, treasure, talent. But look on the other side of the carrot. And the carrot being, if you get on this and do this now and take it seriously, think about the opportunity you have when you can qualify and be awarded contracts that your contemporaries and your competition cannot get because they didn't do it. So there are advantages here to doing this, literally competitive advantages in the marketplace.
Yeah, no, that's a really good analogy, really good call out. So we talked a little bit about like demystifying. What are some like misconceptions about CMMC that you hear a lot when people come to you?
Then
Oh,
anybody
really?
can do it.
Oh, I assumed the opposite.
Well, they think it's easy, it's no big deal, but when they realize how long it takes, how big of a deal it is, what it takes to run the compliance, the policies, helping their team through it, doing gap assessments or mock assessments or readiness if they're sort of closer to being assessed, then and they don't know what's going to cost them, especially the smaller organizations. A couple of weeks ago, there was an event in DC called Seek East. It's a CMMC Ecosystem and Implementation Summit. It's a semi-annual event. It's either here in the DC area, somewhere out west. And at that event, I just happened to be on a conference call based on the VA. It was a VA Office of Small and Disadvantaged Business Units. So a lot of essentially veteran-owned businesses, many of whom are very small. And it was a webinar style. So it was a Q&A coming in. A lot of them were like, why do I have to pay all this money? They're the first time they've heard about CMMC. At the end of the day, the gentleman that was working with me is actually the government contract attorney. So he's talking about the legal side of it. Now let's talk about the technical and compliance side of it, right? So we kind of sort of worked on that together. And overwhelmingly, people are like, that is a lot of money. How's the DoD going to pay for this? I'm like, the DoD is not paying for this.
Yeah.
You are paying for this. And that's a requirement for you to work with the DoD. And I try to deliver that in the best way possible without sounding like a jerk. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But in the end, those are the requirements that it takes. That's what it takes to now play in that space. And some people kind of made a comment like, well, it sounds like pay to play. Not really. This is just the DoD getting serious about protecting their data. And that requires you to do something.
Yeah, and this is not
That's
unique
the
to
rub.
this is not unique to this space. If you want to work in Europe, there's certain cybersecurity frameworks you have to be compliant with. If you want to work in financial tech, you have to look at PCI stuff. There's just so many different frameworks out there. And I think that's where people get overwhelmed a lot. There's so many different frameworks. But I think your point earlier was really good that this isn't like right now you start your business, you need to be playing in the government sector. It's not for everyone. Maybe it's a part of your roadmap or your journey. Maybe 5 years from now, that's a goal that you have, is to start playing in the government space. But yeah, you have to recognize that it might not be for you right now. And if it is for you right now, then you don't have a choice and you have to do this stuff. So those are really the two options.
I mean, I'll just give you an example. For example, we're talking with a company that came to me through a partner, through an MSP, right? Through an IT service provider that's based in Texas. I'll just say that broadly, right? And they came to me and we started, he's the potential MSP. He's somebody that wants to work with them. But long story short, what it came down to was we met with them, had a conversation. And I always say the same thing. How much of your revenue is DoD based? And they're like, it was a very high number. It was like close to 100%. And they make things for let's say warfighter systems. Let's just call it that, right? And they had done all the stuff. And I said, well, where is your current score? What's called the SPUR score, SPRS. And I said, no, we're about, at a pretty low level. I said, at least you're not negative. But they were trying to do it themselves. And they realized, and it was their IT director doing it. And they realized is we're getting stuck. We don't know what to do. They're just getting stuck all the time. And they needed help, right? And that happens all the time. We are brought in often when they try to run it themselves. And then we're brought in to kind of unstick them and say, okay, let's actually create a proper map for you, a timeline, set expectations, write the right policies to make sure when you have to actually get assessed by the third-party auditor, what's called a C3PAO, not R2D2's friend, by the way. And when they come in to assess you, you're actually going to pass your certification assessment.
Yeah.
That's really what you want. You don't want to fail that, because if you fail that, you're kind of going back and starting over again. Not starting over fully, but you know what I mean?
There's a lot of things as a company you want to do yourselves. And for me personally, compliance is not one of them. We always bring in experts for ourselves because it's so overwhelming, whether you're in tech or you're the leadership or whatever. I mean, the amount of controls is just insane.
It's a lot.
Yeah. So where do you see CMMC going, like, over the next few years? What are some things you see coming? Is it sit for a while, or is it going to be kind of an ongoing thing from now on?
Oh, it's going to only ramp up. I mean, right now we're sort of at the very, I mean, if you look at the, the hockey stick, right? We're at the very beginning, sort of early adopters. The vast majority of businesses haven't really recognized it yet. They may have heard about it, but they've done nothing about it, right? We're just sort of starting at the bottom of the hockey stick. We're going to have a time at which we're going to be overwhelmingly busy because there's not enough organizations that can really help them competently, to be clear, competently to help get their program together, their compliance program together. There's going to be a lot of, like anything, just be very careful out there if you're looking at these all-in-one solutions. And I'm not going to name names because I don't want to be sued, right? But they're saying, use our product and you'll be good. CMMC is fine. Like, oh my God, please don't do that, right? Because people believe you, and ultimately you're opening yourself up to legal liability. Not only is the vendor doing that, but you are as well. So just be super careful who you kind of get in bed with, vet them, make sure they've done that, and make sure ideally if they've worked with someone else before in your space, and get some strong references.
One thing that I love that I've been seeing, because we work a lot in the audit space, we work with a lot of like compliance companies and auditors, and it seems like there's a migration now toward, hey, I don't do this specialty, so I'm going to have a trusted partner who knows this world inside and out.
Yeah.
And I love seeing that because none of us can be total experts in
Yeah.
every single piece of this realm. I mean, I guess we're talking about technology as a whole, right? And like it's so extensive, and then you get into compliance and you have 3,000 different compliance frameworks. So,
Yeah.
for like people listening, I know we have a lot of auditors and stuff that are our partners. Highly recommend, at least having a conversation with companies like Exceed. If you're thinking about branching into this, maybe a partnership makes more sense, at least as this is ramping up. I think that's definitely a better way to go.
I think so. I really do. And just kind of address that. I mean, you didn't really ask a question per se, but I'll just kind of give my commentary on
Yeah.
that, which is I think you're right. There are folks that are good, that are specialized in certain things. You can't be, there's more to it, the jack of all trades, master of none. Find people that are learned, capable, and understand what these different, whether it's CMMC, whether it's SOC 2, whether it's ISO 27001, GDPR, pick your flavor, whatever, HIPAA, pick your flavor and find the person that really knows that framework really, really well. And if you're an MSP out there or an MSSP even, and you're not really in the compliance space and you want to kind of do it to go at your own, I mean, good, try it out. I mean, see if you want to do it. But ultimately, if your relationship with your customer is at stake and they could have some sort of liability or risk or culpability, do you really want that? I
Yeah.
would say probably not, right? That's just my take on it.
We love working with partners instead of like, I mean, that's why people always expect us to be like an MSSP, and it's like, no, we are very niche into offensive cybersecurity. That's all we
Mhm.
do. Don't touch defensive. We don't fix anything, and
Right.
we love being niche. And there's a book called The Hedgehog Concept. It's in one of the leadership books somewhere, and it's like the hedgehog is not good at a lot of things as an animal, but it's really good at
Defending.
spikes and protecting itself. And that's why it's survived this long. So I always think
Sure.
about that as people are trying to add on all these different services and offerings. And you got to know what you're good at and what you can add and still be
Yeah.
good at that original thing.
I mean, to your point, right? For example, like I know that you're my go-to company for pen testing, for a real legit, white hat pen testing, for example, or certified ethical hacking, or for incident response. I have partners for that as well. As a matter of fact, I was referred to you by an incident response partner. That's how
Mhm.
we
Yeah.
met, right? So I know that I can't be everything to everyone because I can sort of fake it, but these are the situations in which you do not want to fake it
Yeah.
because your risk and liability is way, way, way too high. Don't even think about it.
Yeah. And
That's
it's a
how I see it. And so I want to bring in the right people that not only take good care of the customer, but also make me look good too.
100%. Well, I guess as we wrap up, for anyone listening, kind of final thoughts if they're just starting on this or they want to learn more or they're overwhelmed, what's your advice, final thoughts?
Sure. So it depends on who we're talking to, who I'm addressing, right? So who would you say I would be addressing?
Government contractors, people that are looking at getting this certification.
So first of all, if you're a government contractor, have an honest conversation. Depends on your size, right? Depends on your size, the location, what you do. But first of all, have a conversation with your internal compliance and security and IT team. If that is your MSP, your managed IT service provider, that's external, what's called an ESP in CMMC speak, an external service provider, have a conversation with them, right? Say, we're being told that we have to do CMMC or we have CUI, we know we have to, whatever that is. Where do we start? So have that conversation first. Hopefully, they are wise and adept enough at taking that information, saying, doing an inward look, saying, you know what, we really need to bring somebody in. And hopefully they'll reach out to someone that's on this call that understands CMMC. And hopefully I'm sure there are many people listening who do know it as well. And hopefully you get that phone call and you can then be that compliance expert that comes and helps kind of sort of shine the light and guides the way, right? But it has to start with an honest conversation and not putting your damn head in the ground.
Yeah.
Doing the ostrich effect doesn't work.
Yeah.
I have this conversation with people, very close people in my life who shall not be named, about the ostrich effect. It doesn't work because ultimately you're just going to shoot yourself in the foot. So have that conversation if you're a defense contractor with those people internal to you, your outside providers, your outside service providers. And if you have compliance people you work with, have that first and then sort of spread the net and saying, hey, you know what? We need to find resources to help us to do this because there's too much at risk with the DoD, especially because we can't lose that business. Especially, let's say if you're in manufacturing making widgets for the Joint Strike Fighter for the F-35, for example, right? Just making screws. It's CUI, it's very customized, right? It's very bespoke, but you're part of the supply chain that's really critical to make that warfighter system, right? And you're doing that, then ultimately, and 50, 60, 80, 90% of your business depends on DoD work. Don't screw it up. Get the right people involved. But have that honest conversation first, look inward, and then share that with your team and say, what do we do? Strategize and make a plan.
Yeah, I think often as leaders and especially tech leaders, like we want to have the answers all the time, and it's okay to ask for help in this stuff.
Absolutely.
We talked about CMMC not being new, but new to some people looking at it for the first time. Like you're not expected to be as knowledgeable as Brian in this stuff. So ask for help, reach out to experts. This stuff is complicated sometimes, so it's okay to ask for help and get that expert advice. Yeah.
Ask for help. Yeah, ask for help. Please do,
Thank you so much, Brian. I learned a lot
Sure.
today. I'm sure viewers did as well. So I'm looking forward to this launches and seeing what happens in 2025 with all of this. So thank you for being on today.
Thanks for having me, Valentina.